Okay, so welcome to episode 5 of the series, Win in the Opening. We're examining the French defense, and we're looking at it from White's perspective. So we're recommending the French advance, and we're just kind of looking at different ideas, different traps, etc., and ways in which you can, if your opponent isn't well prepared, can in fact win straight out of the opening. So for this episode, we're going to be looking at the jumping knights. Basically, we're going to be looking at two of the most typical knight jumps in this particular variation. The first one is actually a knight sacrifice, which is the white knight here on b1. Because it often is on c3, then and typically there is a pawn on d5 and this knight on c3. So in many situations, especially when the black king is here still uncastled, white has the move knight takes d5 with some pretty nasty consequences for black. So that's the first thing that we're going to look at. And then the other thing that we're going to look at is we're going to go on to the kingside knight. That's usually placed on f3, and because there's typically pawns here on e5 and d4, well, the white knight generally is jumping to the square g5, and with the queen on d1, it can actually combine, right? A knight can wind up on g5, and very quickly a queen can end up on h5, and of course the white bishop on f1 can be on d3, and so white can, especially with this typical French advanced structure like this, when a pawn is on e5, it makes communication for black between the queen and the king side a little bit difficult. It restricts black's access to an important square f6, and all of this can make it very, very difficult for him to defend against an attack, especially if it's a quick attack, which white can do on many occasions, simply because he has space and because his pieces are going to be well placed. The bishop on d3, a knight on f3, and a queen that can jump to either h5, g4, or even f3, depending on the situation. So this is what we're going to look at today. Let's okay, so the very first game, we have this position on the board. Black continued with the move c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, all very standard stuff. Queen to b6, bishop d3. We now know that here, after this massive exchange on d4, white would have the check, bishop b5 check, collecting the queen. We saw some games in which black fell for a similar idea, and I believe it was the first episode, but I think it was the second episode, but I'm not 100%. Anyway, so black doesn't capture there. Instead, black continues. Well, he does capture c takes d4, but now he doesn't take. He plays bishop d7, which does create this threat, but white kind of ignores it, right? And this now black could capture, and this is an actual theoretical line where white is giving up a pawn, sometimes even two, but in exchange will have very fast development and can catch black out very, very quickly indeed if black doesn't know his stuff. We're actually going to be looking at this in a subsequent episode, so if you like this line as a possible thing to play as white, then tune in for perhaps I will cover it in the next episode, or if not, the one after that. So so white has castled, and now black plays the move rook to c8. White plays knight c3. He's rejected the pawn sacrifice, but instead continues with f6. White plays rook e1. This is not very advisable play by black. He's already got a little bit of an uncomfortable position here because his king is still in the center. His bishop and his knight still haven't developed. And of course, white, on the other hand, has a safe king, a strongly placed bishop, well-placed knights. And this rook on e1 is crashing down, x-raying the black king. And especially after black's last move of f6, e6 is looking very airy indeed. Black actually played the move f5. And here we see this idea of a possible knight sacrifice. White has tactics here. Knight takes d5, and if e takes d5, then the move e6 is simply crushing. He'll gain back his material, and in the meantime he's going to be opening up lines of attack against the black king. And with black's lack of development, f5 hanging, d5 weak, the white knight jumping in, the bishop as well, possibly jumping into the attack as well, it's very, very difficult to imagine that that black is going to survive this. So black obviously didn't like this idea and instead decided to retreat with his queen, thinking, okay, I've lost the central pawn. And to be honest with you, that is such an important central pawn that even if white simply stepped back with the knight, I would expect that the position is already beyond repair. But white had a very, very strong continuation. He actually played bishop takes f5. Same concept again. If the pawn takes either piece, then after the move e6, black is in a lot of trouble. And after bishop takes f5, he's down 2 pawns, and sure enough, he didn't really want to look at his position much longer, and so he actually resigned in this position. So that's the first idea: knight sacrifice on d5 with I guess a bonus sacrifice on f5 as well in this particular game. Let's look at another game where white sacrifices his knight on d5. So here we are, same position that you're now very familiar with. Knight c6, knight f3, c takes d4, c takes d4, bishop to d7, knight to c3, bishop to b4, bishop to d2, all very normal, both sides trying to develop their pieces. A6, bishop to d3, and now black plays f6. Again, you see the same ideas over and over again. Black is trying to pressure the white center, and white on the other hand has faster development, a safe king, and has some possibilities for attack among other things. Black takes on e5. Now white here is actually a very strong player, 2400 player, but black can hold his own at 2150-ish, and this game was played about I guess a little over 10 years ago in 2005. F takes e5. White now plays the move knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and take a look here that with this diagonal open, an f pawn missing, and the queen on d1, already you can see that black has to be extremely careful not to fall to a vicious attack. So black played the move queen h4, and here white played white responded with the move g3. Now the queen wants to stay somewhere on this file, because what the queen wants to do is it wants to cover the h5 square. If the queen were to retreat here, then already the move queen h5 check would be extremely unpleasant, because black cannot block because of this typical tactical concept. Bishop takes g6 check, and if h takes g6, then the rook on h8 is hanging. So because of this, black played the move queen to h3, and that seems to be a nice square for the queen on h3. But unfortunately, this knight in particular can actually harass this queen if it could only sort of teleport to the f4 square, right? If the white knight could play the move knight to f4 here, the black queen would have to go to h6, and then once the queen is at h6, then knight takes d5 would just be devastating, or things like this, right? I mean, the knight would be in a very, very good square there. So white can kind of turn that dream into a reality with the tactical shot knight takes d5. Now the idea is the bishop is undefended here, so it's being attacked twice. Rather like this, it's being attacked twice. Black doesn't have the time to play e takes d5, simply because white would capture on b4, and now he would not only be up a pawn, but he'd have the bishop pair as well, a very, very strong central pawn. Black's d5 pawn is very weak, so the whole situation would be dire for black. Instead of this, after knight takes d5, black could capture on d2, but the problem with this is white has the move knight c7 check in between move. Now if the king steps away, white can simply capture on d2, and he's up a pawn. He has an attack on the rook, and he has an attack on the uncastled and sort of very airy black king, let's say. So black has to play the move king to d8, but now after even the quiet move queen takes d2, king takes c6, and now even though white is actually down a piece temporarily, white has so many lines of attack against the unprotected black king. Queen a5 check, rook ac1, rook fd1, the bishop can move to e4 even, and in fact this position is hopeless. Black is gonna get either mated, or he's gonna lose a lot of material trying to find a home for his king, right? So the position is pretty hopeless here, and so instead of all of this, black went a different route. He played the move bishop to c6. Now the idea with this move is after knight c7 check, black would actually be playing king to d7, and white doesn't have the time to either grab the rook or the bishop, because this bishop on c6 and this queen on h3 are combining, and there's a threat of queen g2 checkmate. So because of all of this, after bishop c6, you might think, well, black has gotten away with it, right? White could capture here, but after bishop takes d5, hey, you know, white is up a pawn, but black has a strong bishop on d5, has some mating ideas against the white king, so maybe things aren't quite so clear. However, white has a crushing move here in the form of knight f4, hits the queen, covers the g2 square. Black queen must move, and next move bishop takes b4 is coming, winning not only a pawn that the white knight collected on d5, but also winning a bishop. So here black had enough and did indeed resign. So yeah, that's the concept of a knight sacrifice on d5. Definitely something to keep in mind. Now, we said at the start of the video that we were also going to look at something else. Specifically the knight. We've looked at the queenside knight and this jump to d5. Now we're going to look at the kingside knight and the typical jump to g5 and the damage that it can cause there. Okay, so let's move on to. So we are back with our good friend Mr. Arthur Kogan, a strong grandmaster, has played a lot of tournament chess over the years, and he likes to demolish the French defense if his opponents are not careful. So let's go back to a normal position, e5, c5, and now white, in this case, he chose to continue with the move knight f3. Black played knight c6, bishop to d3, bishop to d7, castle, queen to b6, rook to e1. This is a bit of a pet line of Mr. Kogan. Black plays the move c takes d4. White plays a3, black plays a5 to prevent this idea of b4 with bishop b2 coming and then, you know, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. White is temporarily down a pawn, but he's okay with that because he has a very strong pawn on e5. He has more development. Notice the black king is still uncastled and in fact has a long way to go before it can castle. So, you know, this is all, you know, pretty common temporary pawn sacrifice idea. So after a3, a5, white now, because of his better development, can already kind of go on to the attack with the move knight to g5. And already here you have some possibilities of white simply snatching the pawn on h7, which will be a big problem because black sooner or later needs to figure out where he's going to put the king. He'd like to castle at kingside, and that's going to be difficult to do if you're missing the pawn on h7. So after the move knight to g5, black played the move g6. Problem with this is that it really weakens your dark squares. Now white actually takes advantage of this with the move queen f3. Notice that because the dark squares are weakened, black cannot play a move like f6 because after e takes f6, then, you know, here this pawn is simply gonna win for white on the spot. Of course, if the black pawn was still on g7, then of course f6 might be one way of defending. After g6, queen f3, white is actually already with a very nice initiative. Black had to play the move knight d8 to cover f7, but after knight d8, white continued calmly, played the move a4. Black played knight e7. Notice how moves like h6 are extremely dangerous because white has this typical sacrificial idea. Knight takes f7, knight takes, and now that the pawn has advanced, it's no longer protecting the g6 square. Bishop takes g6, the knight on f7 is falling and there is no way to defend it. So black presumably saw this and instead continued the game with the move knight to e7. But unfortunately, the knight here on g8 was playing a very important role. It was covering the f6 square. White's queen here on f3 decides to take advantage of that, plays the move queen to f6, hitting the rook on h8. Black has no choice but to play the move rook g8, and sure enough, the pawn, knight takes h7, the pawn on h7 winds up falling. But here there's a very, very nice tactic coming up. Black played the move bishop to g7, a very natural move, and now white had a wonderful response. And after white's move, black actually saw no point in continuing. You can pause the video if you wish, and try to figure out what move white played. So white played very nice sacrificial idea, queen takes bishop on g7. Black actually resigned here, but let's see why he resigned here. Black can play the move rook takes queen, knight f6 check. Notice the lack of space for the black king, so he's only got one square to go to. He goes to f8, knight takes d7. White now has two pieces for the queen, but the real problem is that black's king is in check once again, has to step away, and now the queen on b6 is won, and so white with this combination wins two pieces, and that explains why black resigned after only 14 moves. Okay, so that was a pretty brutal attack. Let's take a look at one more brutal attack now, with involving this very sharp and very quick knight jump to g5. So c5, c3, again, same old. And now black continued with the move knight to c6, right? We've seen that there are other options like queen b6 is the other popular continuation. Knight f3, bishop to d7, and a3. Again, nothing new under the sun. Move c4 is played, knight bd2. And now here black plays the move knight a5. So, you know, if we look at the previous episode, sometimes black is going to play queen b6 and a quick knight b3. And if he's not careful, he might wind up losing a bishop on a4. You'll be familiar with that if you've seen the previous episode. So after the move knight a5, in this case the game continued with g3. Black plays the move knight e7. Notice how now the g5 square is available. White plays the move h4, seeking to maybe press down on the h file. In general here black should ignore this, maybe play whatever, you know, a queen move or something like this. And now if white plays h5, then you block with h6, because then at least you have, you know, 2 pawns here on the dark squares, 2 pawns on the light squares, and you kind of have good structural integrity, shall we say, right? You have good control of all the squares. If you let this pawn jump on all the way onto h6 and you respond with g6, then all of your pawns are on light squares, and that's going to be a problem because black is going to be very, very dominant along the dark squares, and that can cause a lot of trouble when trying to defend against the possible attack. Instead, white actually after white's move of h4, let's go back. After the move of h4, black played a surprisingly poor move actually for a player as strong as this guy. The tournament was played, the game was played in Austria in 1996, and the opponent, white, was rated just under 2200, but black was actually rated 2275. So it's a little bit surprising that he chose to move h5, because it seems that's a huge weakening of the dark squares. And sure enough, white immediately punished this with the move knight to g5. Now the knight on g5 is going to cause a lot of trouble for white, for black. There's moves like queen to f3 and hitting f7 coming in very soon. And so black decided he wanted to get rid of the knight as soon as possible, and he played the move f6. But notice that he's opening up this diagonal against his king, and that's a particularly dangerous thing to do when you've got your bishop on d7, your knight on e7, and your queen is still on d8. So the black king is kind of, I like to call this in a position of stalemate, right? Because the knight on g5 is covering the f7 square, and the king is being smothered by his other pieces. So there's nowhere to run for the king, and sure enough, white is able to exploit this tactically. Are you able to see the move? Feel free to pause the video if you wish. Okay, so the crushing move here is white simply brings another piece into the attack. After f6, he plays e takes f6. Then he plays g takes f6. Sorry, rather I should have asked, perhaps in this particular position, if you didn't see it earlier, are you able to see the move now? Okay, so the idea is he does indeed bring another piece into attack. He plays the move bishop to e2, hitting the h5 point. And simply because of this stalemated kind of king that we have in this particular situation, and this open diagonal, this exposed diagonal, we've already seen in previous videos the importance of this exposed diagonal in certain situations. In this case, the knight cannot be captured because after bishop takes h5 check, white is almost checkmating his opponent. He does have the move knight g6, but after bishop takes g6 check, white gets back his sacrifice piece with a lot of interest. The king has to step onto e7, and after a move like knight f3, white is threatening bishop takes g5 check, collecting the queen on d8. So here black is losing at a bare minimum 2 pawns, and his entire position, his king is going to be very unsafe, and his entire position is just falling apart. So because of this, after the move bishop to e2, black had he realized that there was no way to to fix his position. The damage had been done, and he resigned. Let's take a look at a couple more games, right? Let's go back to this position here, starting position, and black here played the move f6, immediately trying to undermine the center. White played bishop d3, but notice he's already exposed this diagonal. After the move bishop d3, black plays g6. Very, very kind of unusual treatment of the opening. I personally am not entirely convinced by this handling of the opening, although it must be said that the player who was playing black was a 2365 rated player, so certainly no pushover. White played the move knight to f3, black played bishop g7, and now white played the move h4. F takes e5 was played, and here the move bishop g5, developing the bishop and gaining some time against the black queen. Black plays the move bishop f6, which, if you have to play this, then something's gone wrong with your opening, because after the move bishop f6, d takes e5, black is pretty much forced to play bishop takes g5, and now knight takes g5. And the problem is, we've seen this before, I've said it several times, all of the black pawns are on light squares. That means that your dark squares are the ones that you really need to be careful for, because the pawns are doing a good job. They're kind of building a wall along the light squares, but there's an imbalance there, and white can very often take advantage of this. In this case, black continues, and of course, the final point that I want to make is, when you have all your pawns like this, in general, this is going to be your bad bishop, and the absent bishop here that went to g7, but then after bishop f6, black traded it off. It's now gone, and and the black king is extremely exposed, right? So black tried to continue his development, knight e7, but already the white queen is coming to try and hunt the black queen with the move queen f3, and now black can no longer castle, so those plans have been scuppered, and black plays the move rook f8, and white plays the move queen to g4. And notice here, white already has a double attack on e6 and on h7, and so black, after this move, he played the move h6. It's very, very difficult to suggest anything better. For example, if he returns with the rook to h8, if he goes back like this, then not only is knight takes e7 possible, but in particular, the move h5 is simply devastating. It is bringing this rook crashing down into the attack. A move like h6 wouldn't be possible, if nothing else, because h takes g6. Now, of course, h takes g5 is not possible because the rook is captured on h8. So this position is just a total collapse. Notice all of black's pieces cut off from the defense of the king, and white is using his bishop, his queen, his knight, and even his rook into attack, and his king is relatively safe here on e1. So it's really a disaster. So black wasn't going to play like this, and instead he chose to move h6, but of course this is no good either. Again, knight takes e6 I think is very strong here, but white found, I think, arguably a stronger move. Knight h7 creates two threats, knight takes f8 and bishop takes g6. Both of them are very strong. Now black cannot stop both. If he plays a move like rook to f7, then white can choose between bishop takes g6 immediately, or even knight f6 check followed by bishop takes g6. Both of them should be winning. And if instead after knight h7, black tries to come to the defense of the g6 square with a move like rook g8, then white has the move knight f6 check, and at the very, very least, white is collecting a exchange. But of course his position is also very, very good. So after the move knight h7, black decided to resign. So let's take a look at perhaps one more game illustrating this theme of knight g5, this typical knight jump with a very, very fast, lightning fast, and possibly devastating attack if black is not prepared. Let's look at this next one. It's a game played in 2004, and it is short and sweet. e5, c5, c3, knight to d7, knight to f3, knight to e7, bishop to d3, a6, castle, c4, bishop to c2, knight to c6. This is an interesting idea, actually. Bring the knight from g8 to c6 and the knight on b8 to d7, and this way you find a square for both knights. One of the problems with this, however, is that the knight, which started off on g8, it was the kingside knight, it's migrated over to the queen side. Problem with that is that if black is going to sort of try to find shelter for his king on the king side, then he is setting himself up for an attack, and he may not have enough pieces to hold off white's offensive. So after move knight c6, in fact, white immediately tries to punish this two-tempo migration to the queen side and jumps in with knight g5. Now this is already hitting h7, but it's also eyeing up the f7 square and maybe even the e6 square. Black plays the move h6, trying to kick out the knight. Problem with this is that you do weaken your light squares that bit more, but now white actually had a very nice tactical shot, very thematic. He plays the move queen to h5. Now if black captures the knight on g5, then after the move queen takes rook, it's a clean exchange and very, very difficult for black to play on. And the problem is here that black realized that the very, very simple, almost beginner-like threat against the f7 square is it's actually impossible to parry. There's only two ways that come to mind. The first one is to block the attack with the move g6, but here after g6, even bishop takes g6, f takes g6, queen takes g6, king e7 would be queen f7 with a typical mate. And of course, if g6 is not an option, then the only other way to defend f7 would be to play the move queen to e7. But are you able to see how white would continue if black went this route instead? So white would actually continue with the thematic sacrifice, knight takes f5. We saw that with the move h6, black was weakening his light squares. One of the key squares, of course, being g6, right? The pawn on h7 covers the g6 square, but from h6 it doesn't cover it, and so knight takes f7 is possible because queen takes knight is not a good idea, because bishop g6, taking advantage of the queen and the king's placement and the weakness of the light squares. Thematic attacking concept. And so this is really quite an instructive game, I think, because it's a little bit sad that black's position is just already untenable after 10 moves, and I think that there's a lot of instructive value in these kind of quick games. Okay, I've decided to look at one more game, and it really will be the last one. There are more examples of this, but I want to try and keep the video not too much over the half-hour mark, right? So let's go with the final game, e4. And now, as we've seen before on a few occasions, it starts off as a Sicilian. This game, by the way, played in, I think, Slovenia in 1995. White is a 2400 plus player, and black is just a whisker under 2200 rated. So so c3, e6, d4, d5, e5, and now in this position, knight to c6, knight to f3, and now we go back into these familiar French advance waters. Black plays the move bishop to d7, and now white plays bishop to e3. Sometimes threatening to capture on c5. Black plays queen c7. Now if white captures, well, black can respond in kind. After the move queen c7, white plays bishop to e2. Black plays knight g to e7, castle, and now black brings his knight out. Again, we've seen this maneuver several times. The knight is at f5, and now white hits the knight. As we've seen, black generally doesn't want to allow this because it would damage his pawn structure. So instead he plays c takes d4, c takes d4. And here black doesn't want to bring his knight out and doesn't want to let white capture. So he plays the move knight takes e3. But of course after f takes e3, sure, on the one hand he's gotten the bishop pair, but there's a very, very big risk here, which is that the f pawn, we've seen how vulnerable the f pawn can be in the French advance variation, especially because this pawn here really limits its movement. and of course blocks a knight from being on f6, which can sometimes help out in defense by, you know, blocking some files. And here, as we can see, after f takes and f takes, there's been a semi-open file created for the rook on f1, and already we can see that a move like knight to g5 would put a lot of pressure on the f pawn. So black would need to have, you know, been careful for this and being careful about this and prevented it. A move like bishop to e7 comes to mind, taking control of the g5 square, and hopefully black can, you know, maybe survive after castling short, or, you know, playing knight d8 and hanging on to f7. We'll see, but it would have been a game, right? But instead of this, black, you know, commits a kind of a cardinal sin of openings, shall we say, which is being very, very much underdeveloped relative to white. White has a safe king, black does not have a safe king. He goes ahead and he plays the move knight to b4, which is you know, an offensive move, right? I mean, if you look at this, is white's side of the board, shall we say, white's half. He steps onto white's half of the board, greedily trying to grab this bishop on d3, but ignoring the very, very strong threat. White is better prepared, so it makes sense that after knight g5, black shouldn't have any kind of response. But I guess that black thought after the move bishop to e7, now rook takes f7 doesn't work because I will capture on g5. So instead, knight takes f7. So what had black seen here? Well, he had the idea here that he would castle. And as a result of castling, now the bishop is controlling the g5 square. If the knight steps onto d6, well, at the very least, the bishop can grab the knight and win the sacrificed pawn back. So it would appear as though, you know, white is going to have to give back his one pawn. And then, you know, if he has to play a move like knight to d6, then black is going to have a really nice position because he can swap off rooks on the f file. He can take this nasty white bishop. And then the remaining pieces, you know, if white loses his knight and loses his bishop and loses his rook, the remaining white pieces are actually the least active ones, right? So the tables would be turned. But unfortunately, chess generally doesn't work that way, and you cannot expect this kind of thing to work out in black's favor. So sure enough here, white has a very nice tactical shot. Feel free to pause the video and try to figure it out. So white continued with the move bishop takes h7 check. Now the black king cannot step onto h8 because the knight covers, so black can only capture on h7. Bear in mind, black actually just resigned here on the spot. He would have seen the following continuation: king takes h7, queen h5 check. Again, the king can only step back onto g8. The knight is on f7, it's covering the h8 square, so queen h8 is checkmate. And notice how useful the semi-open f file is. The king cannot capture the knight because the rook on f1 is anchoring that knight, and the knight anchors the queen, and so it's checkmate. So that's it for this episode. A little bit longer, but it's kind of difficult to squeeze in all of these game examples in a shorter space of time. And also I particularly think that this knight jump to g5 with some very attacking ideas along the f7 square, the h7 square, sometimes even the g6 square, is very, very important, because one of the things that you will learn, let's say in time, perhaps I'll do a video series about this if there is interest, is that with this kind of structure, when the pawn is on e5, it generally enables white to launch strong attacks against a black king side, and vice versa. Here the pawn on d5 will actually typically give black an advantage on the queen side. And if, for example, we had a different situation, let's say we go back and we do something like e3, you know, let's say e5, d4, e4, right? Let's, you know, just kind of imagine that white plays like this a little bit passively. Then the pawn on e4 enables black to launch a strong attack. Notice bishop to d6 would crash on h2. This bishop would be open against h3. The knight on f6 could jump to g4 very quickly. The queen on h4 could create a lot of problems, or even on g5. So it's kind of visually quite easy to see why these kind of attacks are strong. And therefore, in what we're looking at right now, which is this kind of structure, right, we particularly want to keep an eye on certain ideas like knight f3 and knight g5, followed by queen sorties to h5 typically, but sometimes also to f3 instead. So yeah, that is it for me. I don't know if the rest of the series is going to be limited to one more episode or perhaps two. As always, I welcome feedback. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, then please subscribe for more regular content along similar lines. Okay, so goodbye and until next time.